He said he had been driving around Europe, just driving around. No destination, no plan, no reason. A man in a Volkswagen with nowhere particular to be, rolling off a ferry at 5 in the morning.
Proceed to secondary.
Alone.
Pull into the bay.
Border Force officers at Dover had
Keep
heard
your hands
better
visible.
stories.
Stay in the
They
vehicle.
pulled him over. What they found inside his car would go into the record books and the courtroom as the single largest seizure of lethal firearms ever made at a British port. 5 in the morning at Dover. There is something particular about 5 in the morning at a seaport. The ferry crossings run around the clock on the English Channel, the world's busiest shipping lane, 33 miles at its narrowest point, never truly quiet. But the early hours carry a different quality from the afternoon rush. The coaches and tourist families and lorries loaded with continental produce are elsewhere. What arrives at 5 in the morning are the overnight crossings, the tired commercial drivers, the irregular travelers whose journeys do not fit neatly into conventional schedules. On Friday, 2nd of August 2019, at that quiet hour, a Volkswagen Passat rolled off a ferry from Calais and into the tourist controls at Dover Eastern Docks. Behind the wheel was a 37-year-old man from Cloney, County Meath, in the Irish Republic. His name was Robert Keogh. He had dark hair and an unremarkable face. He looked like countless other drivers who pass through Dover every day. Slightly tired, slightly rumpled, the vague, disconnected look of someone who has been traveling for too long. When Border Force officers stopped the car and asked Keogh what he had been doing in Europe, he offered them an answer that was simultaneously simple and implausible. He said, been driving around. Just driving around Europe. No specific destination named.
Proceed
no
to secondary.
particular
Pull into the bay.
offered. No friends visited.
Keep your
no
hands
family
visible.
seen,
Stay in the vehicle.
No business conducted. A man in a car and the open roads of the continent. There is a category of answer that experienced border officers recognize immediately. Not because it is obviously false, but because it is too thin, too unelaborated. Real travelers, even those with nothing to hide, have stories. They have names of places and people. They have receipts in their pockets and photographs on their phones. They have the texture of actual experience. The answer just driving around is a blank where a story should be. Officers pulled the Volkswagen Passat into a secondary examination bay. They began their search. Within the first hour, they found a gun, the first find. The initial discovery was made in the rear left quarter panel of the car. Concealed there, carefully fitted into the internal space between the exterior bodywork and the inner lining, was a Turkish-manufactured Zoraki blank-firing handgun. A starting pistol design that had been professionally modified, its barrel reamed and fitted to fire live ammunition rather than the blanks for which it was sold. One gun, hidden in a quarter panel. For many search operations, that would be the end of it. A significant find, certainly, but a single firearm, an arrest, a prosecution. But the Border Force officers who pulled Keogh aside that August morning were not operating with a casual toolkit. They called in the National Crime Agency, and the NCA brought with it specialist deep rummage teams. Officers trained to take vehicles apart with methodical precision, panel by panel, cavity by cavity, following the logic of concealment to its furthest point. What those teams found, over the hours that followed the initial discovery, would rewrite the record book. 60 guns. The full search of Robert Keogh's Volkswagen Passat took several hours. What emerged piece by piece from its hidden spaces was a haul that the National Crime Agency would describe in its official communications as the largest seizure of lethal barrel firearms ever made at a UK port. 60 firearms. All of them 9mm self-loading pistols. All of them manufactured in Turkey. All of them converted from blank firing designs to fire live ammunition. The same modification technique seen in the initial Zoraki find, applied systematically across the entire consignment. All of them with their serial numbers removed. Each weapon was wrapped tightly in plastic, the kind of careful packaging that speaks to a professional operation. Someone who had done this before. Someone who understood that firearms left loose in a car cavity rattle and shift and can be heard. Alongside the weapons, searchers found 4 magazines, a quantity of latex gloves, the universal mark of those who handle firearms without wanting to leave fingerprints, and documentation in Turkish. The paperwork was not explained at trial, but its presence confirmed what the phone data would later make explicit. These guns had come from Turkey, and their journey to a Volkswagen Passat in Calais had been organized, deliberate, and carefully managed. 60 weapons, hidden in 3 locations, deep in the car's rear bumper, and concealed in both rear quarter panels. Dave Hutchinson, Deputy Director of Border Force Southeast and Europe, would later note that the first gun was found within an hour, but it took several hours for his highly trained technical vehicle search officers to recover the remaining 59. The scale of the concealment was not improvised. It was engineered. If you had not been stopped, it is highly likely that numerous people would have been threatened, and some shot, and perhaps some killed. Judge Rupert Lowe, Canterbury Crown Court. Judge Rupert Lowe, sentencing Keogh at Canterbury Crown Court in November 2019, put the potential consequences in terms that left no room for abstraction. Those 60 guns, had they reached their intended recipients in Britain, would have been distributed into the criminal marketplace, rented out, sold on, used in armed robberies, gang executions, and the day-to-day enforcement violence of organized crime networks. They would have been at crime scenes. They would have been used to threaten, to intimidate, and to kill. None of that happened. Because at 5 in the morning, on a Friday in August, a border force team at Dover stopped a man with a thin story and a hidden cargo. The man behind the wheel, Robert Keogh, was not, by any standard measure, a sophisticated criminal. He was not a fixer or a planner or a man with connections that stretched across organized crime networks in multiple countries. He was a 37-year-old from County Meath with a gambling addiction, a substance abuse problem, and a record that spoke to petty dishonesty rather than serious organized crime. His criminal history in Ireland was a catalog of deception charges and theft offenses. The kind of record that builds up around people who are perpetually short of money and perpetually willing to cut corners to get it. He had served a 12-month prison sentence for fraud and deception offenses. He had been released from that sentence in January 2019. Less than 8 months later, he was arrested at Dover with 60 guns in his car. The trajectory is a familiar one in the study of criminal courier recruitment. Prison is, among other things, a networking environment for criminal organizations. OCGs, organized crime groups, operate inside prison estates, identifying individuals who are desperate, malleable, and about to be released into circumstances of financial vulnerability. A man coming out of a prison sentence has no income, often no stable housing, a record that makes legitimate employment difficult, and debts that may have accumulated in his absence. He is, in the cold calculus of criminal recruitment, a resource waiting to be used. Keogh's defense barrister, Paul Hogben, told Canterbury Crown Court that his client had played a courier role after falling into the wrong hands, the standard framing for cases where someone of limited criminal sophistication has been recruited as a vehicle for other people's ambitions. Hogben described a man with a serious gambling addiction and substance abuse issues who had made efforts to address both, and who had been working in a trusted kitchen role since being remanded into custody. The debt that started it. In interview with NCA officers, Keogh gave an account of how he came to be driving through France with 60 illegal firearms in his car. The starting point, he said, was a gambling debt of 3,000 euros. 3,000 euros. It is not a trivial sum for a man with no income and a fresh release from prison, but neither is it the kind of debt that should logically lead to cross-continental firearms smuggling. The gap between 3,000 euros of gambling debt and 60 guns in a Volkswagen is enormous, and it speaks to the way criminal recruitment works, which is rarely through a single straightforward offer of proportionate risk and reward. Criminal organizations recruit incrementally. A favor leads to another favor. A small job establishes trust and complicity. Each step is individually explicable, individually survivable, individually deniable, until the moment when the person involved looks around and realizes they are somewhere they cannot easily leave. By the time Keogh understood the full nature of what he had agreed to, he was already committed. He told the court he was going to be paid 10,000 euros for the run. He also told the court something more revealing, that during a stopover in Hackney, East London, a detail that placed the operation firmly within a domestic criminal network, he thought he might be shot if he refused to cooperate. He feared for the safety of his family. Whether that fear was genuine or a post-arrest narrative constructed to reduce moral culpability is something only Keogh can know. But the structure of the account is consistent with how these operations work. A person is recruited, moved incrementally to a point of commitment, and then discovers that the exit door has been locked behind them. The route, from Turkey to Dover. The 60 pistols found in Keogh's Volkswagen were Turkish-manufactured. Phone data recovered by NCA investigators confirmed that Keogh had traveled to Turkey in the period before his arrest, a detail that placed him directly in the country of origin of the weapons and suggested his involvement extended beyond simply driving a car across the channel. Turkey occupies a specific and significant position in the European criminal firearms market. The country has a substantial legitimate arms manufacturing industry, producing blank-firing pistols, starting guns, and theatrical props for sale across Europe under various legal designations. These weapons are sold openly in Turkish shops and online platforms to buyers in countries with more permissive firearms regulations than the UK. The conversion process, transforming a blank firer into a live-fire weapon, requires metalworking skills and the right tooling, but is not beyond the capability of a reasonably equipped workshop. Converted Turkish pistols have appeared at crime scenes across Britain and Western Europe in significant numbers over the past decade. They are cheaper than genuine military surplus weapons, easier to source through semi-legal retail channels, and harder to trace because they begin their lives as legitimate commercial products with no criminal record attached. The route from Turkey to Britain would typically run through multiple European jurisdictions. A consignment of 60 weapons, once converted and packaged, would need to be transported from Turkey to a staging point in Western Europe, likely France, given the Calais connection, before being loaded into a vehicle for the final leg across the Channel. Each stage of that journey represents both a logistical challenge and a moment of exposure. The professional packaging and engineering of the concealment in Keogh's car indicates an operation that had been run before, by people who understood what worked and what did not. The Hackney stopover. One of the most significant details in the Keogh case is the Hackney stopover. Records showed that Keogh had entered the UK through Holyhead, the Welsh ferry port connecting to Dublin, on the 24th of July, 2019, more than a week before his arrest at Dover. He had then stopped in Hackney, East London. In the geography of British organized crime, Hackney carries specific weight. East London has historically been territory contested by multiple criminal networks, and while it would be reductive to suggest that any single organization dominates the area, it is a location with dense criminal infrastructure. Networks for moving goods, people, and money, established contacts, and the kind of anonymous urban environment in which transactions of all kinds can be conducted without drawing attention. Keogh told the court that during the Hackney stopover, the vehicle was out of his control for 3 days. This account, if accurate, suggests a specific operational structure. Keogh drove the empty car to a location in East London, handed it to people he may or may not have known, and collected it again 3 days later with 60 guns already loaded into its cavities. He then drove to Dover, crossed to Calais, drove around the continent for a period of time whose purpose is not entirely clear, and returned. The 3-day absence of the vehicle is significant forensically. It is during that period, if the account is accurate, that the firearms were loaded and the professional concealment was installed. The people who did that work, whoever fitted 60 weapons into the precisely engineered spaces of a Volkswagen Passat's rear bodywork, are not named in the public record of Keogh's case. They remain, as the architects of these operations typically do, invisible to the criminal justice process that caught only the courier. The record that was set when the National Crime Agency and Border Force completed their count of the weapons recovered from Keogh's Volkswagen, they found themselves in possession of a number that was, by the standards of UK port seizures, unprecedented. 60 firearms, No other single seizure at a British port had yielded as many lethal barrel weapons. To understand the significance of this figure, it is worth placing it in context. UK Border Force makes firearm seizures regularly. Single weapons, sometimes small groups, occasionally larger consignments. The criminal market for illegal firearms in Britain is persistent and well supplied, drawing on sources in Eastern Europe, the Western Balkans, Turkey, and elsewhere. But 60 functional handguns in a single vehicle represented a volume of supply that, had it reached the intended buyers, would have materially shifted the availability of firearms in whatever criminal network it was destined for. Each of the 60 weapons was a 9mm self-loading pistol, a practical, reliable caliber that is the standard for both legitimate and criminal firearms markets worldwide. Each had been converted from a blank firer to a live-fire weapon. Each had its serial number removed, making individual tracing impossible. This last detail is particularly telling. Removing serial numbers is not the act of someone who intends to use the weapons themselves. It is the act of someone who is preparing a product for onward sale, who understands that traceable weapons are commercially less valuable in criminal markets. The weapons were going somewhere specific. They had been ordered, funded, collected, converted, packaged, and transported at considerable expense and risk by a criminal network that had customers waiting. The disruption caused by their seizure at Dover extended beyond the loss of the physical weapons. It meant the criminal clients who had commissioned the order went unserved, and the OCG behind the operation faced both a financial loss and a credibility problem with its supply chain. The investigation. The Border Force stop was the beginning, not the end, of the law enforcement work in this case. Once the first weapon was found and the NCA was called in, the investigation shifted from detection to intelligence, from the question of what was in the car to the question of who put it there, who ordered it, and where it was going. NCA investigators examined Keogh's phone. What they found confirmed the Turkish connection. Evidence of travel to Turkey in the period before the arrest, consistent with a direct role in sourcing or collecting the weapons. This detail moved Keogh from a pure courier, someone who simply drives a preloaded vehicle, to something more involved. A courier who travels to the country of origin of the weapons, who has direct contact with the supply chain, is a more significant node in the network than one who simply collects a car and drives it. The investigation also mapped Keogh's movements through the UK in the days before the arrest, the Holyhead entry, the Hackney stopover, the subsequent journey to Dover. Each location represented a potential intelligence lead, people who had been met, addresses where the car had been parked, communications made and received. The NCA does not publicly detail the full scope of its investigations in these cases, but the reconstruction of a suspect's movements is standard procedure, and each step of Keogh's journey through Britain and Europe would have been examined. What the public record does not reveal is whether the investigation extended to arrests beyond Keogh himself. The NCA press release following his sentencing focused on the seizure and the sentence, noting that the firearms belonged to an organized crime group whose plans were significantly disrupted. The language of disruption rather than dismantlement suggests that the network remained functional, that Keogh was, as couriers typically are, a replaceable part of a larger machine that was damaged by this operation but not destroyed. The strength of the case. NCA Head of Regional Investigations Andrea Wilson, speaking after the sentencing, described the case against Keogh in terms that were notable for their directness. It was so strong, she said, that he had to plead guilty very early. There was no viable defense to offer. The weapons were in his car. His phone placed him in Turkey. His movements through Britain pointed to a specific operational sequence. The physical evidence was comprehensive, and the forensic work was solid. A guilty plea, in British criminal procedure, typically attracts a sentence discount of around a third. It also, critically, avoids the cost and exposure of a full trial for the defendant, who does not have to sit through weeks of evidence being presented against him, and for the prosecution, which does not have to expose the full scope of its intelligence methods and sources to public scrutiny. The early plea was, in the circumstances, the rational choice. It was also, given the weight of the evidence, the only available one. Canterbury Crown Court. Canterbury Crown Court sits in the cathedral city of Kent, a few miles inland from Dover. It is the court where channel-related crime most often comes to be judged, a consequence of geography that gives the court a specific character. Its judges and advocates are familiar with the mechanics of cross-channel smuggling, with the patterns of OCG courier operations, and with the challenge of sentencing individuals who are, by the structure of the operations they participate in, both genuinely culpable and genuinely limited in their knowledge of the full picture. On the 11th of November 2019, Robert Keogh appeared before Judge Rupert Lowe for sentencing. The judge had heard the facts of the case, the 60 firearms, the Turkish origin, the Hackney stopover, the gambling debt, the claimed coercion. He had heard the mitigation offered on Keogh's behalf, the addiction, the vulnerability, the claimed fear for his family, the early guilty plea, the kitchen job in custody. Judge Lowe was not moved to excessive leniency. The words he used in passing sentence have been widely reported, and they deserve to be reproduced in full because they capture with precision exactly what was at stake in this case. He told Keogh, "If you had not been stopped, it is highly likely that numerous people would have been threatened and some shot, and perhaps some killed, by criminals using the illegal prohibited weapons that you were knowingly driving into this country." Knowingly. That word carries weight. The defense had framed Keogh as a man who had been manipulated, who had been pulled into something larger than himself, who had feared for his safety. All of that may have been true, but he had still driven to Turkey. He had still collected or arranged the collection of 60 guns. He had still driven them through France and onto a ferry to Britain. At every stage he had known, at some level, what he was doing. Judge Lowe sentenced Keogh to 9 years in prison. The sentence reflected the gravity of the offense, the record-breaking scale of the seizure, the criminal purpose of the weapons, the potential for catastrophic harm had they reached their destination, while acknowledging his courier status within a larger network. The gambling addiction, a recruitment tool. The detail of the gambling debt deserves more attention than it typically receives in media coverage of this case, because it illuminates something important about how criminal networks identify and exploit vulnerable people. Gambling addiction is, in the clinical and forensic literature, closely associated with risk tolerance, impaired decision-making around odds and consequences, and a capacity for denial that extends well beyond the gambling context itself. A person with a serious gambling addiction has typically spent years making decisions that most people would recognize as irrational, betting money they cannot afford to lose, believing in outcomes that the evidence does not support, returning again and again to a behavior pattern that has demonstrably harmed them. The addiction rewires the risk calculus. For criminal recruiters, this rewired risk calculus is a feature, not a bug. A person with a gambling addiction is accustomed to taking large risks for the chance of reward. They are frequently in debt and frequently desperate. They may have exhausted legitimate options, family support, employment, bank borrowing, and be looking at a wall. When an offer arrives that promises 10,000 euros for a single journey across Europe, the cost-benefit analysis that an addiction-free person would conduct simply does not happen in the same way. Keogh's 3,000 euro gambling debt was, in this reading, less a financial problem and more a psychological opening, a crack in his decision-making that someone in the OCG was experienced enough to identify and exploit. The debt was the key. The 10,000 euro payment was the door, and the fear of being shot, real or manufactured, was the lock on the exit. This pattern, vulnerability identification, exploitation, escalation, entrapment, is not unique to Keogh. It is the standard operating procedure of OCG courier recruitment across the spectrum of drug, weapons, and cash smuggling operations. The courier is always the most exposed person in the chain and the least informed. They bear the full legal risk of interdiction, while knowing the least about the operation they are part of. Britain's biggest port seizure, the numbers behind the record. The claim that the Keogh seizure was the largest ever made at a British port was not marketing language from the NCA's communications team. It was a forensic statement of fact, based on the NCA's own records of previous port seizures of lethal firearms going back through the history of the organization and its predecessors. To appreciate what 60 converted 9mm pistols represent as a criminal supply consignment, consider the structure of the illegal firearms market in Britain. Demand for illegal handguns in the UK criminal market is substantial and consistent. Unlike the United States, where legal gun ownership provides a large shadow market of traceable weapons, Britain's strict licensing regime means that every handgun in criminal use was either illegally converted, smuggled, or reactivated from a deactivated state. The supply chain for each weapon involves multiple criminal actors and significant financial investment. A single handgun in the UK criminal marketplace may be rented out for a specific job, a robbery, a debt enforcement, a targeted threat, for several £100s per use. Over its criminal life, a single weapon may generate thousands of pounds for its owner, while the underlying capital value of the weapon itself is preserved. 60 such weapons, entering the market simultaneously, represent a potential criminal revenue stream running well into 6 figures. They also represent 60 individual threats, 60 potential crime scenes, 60 potential victims, 60 events in the chain of harm that illegal firearms create when they circulate in criminal networks. Each of those events might be a robbery that traumatizes a family, a gangland shooting that kills a young man at a bus stop, a domestic incident in which a threatened woman finds herself facing a loaded weapon. The abstraction of 60 guns in a seizure photograph hides 60 specific human stories that, in another timeline, would have happened. They did not happen, because the record was set in an inspection bay, not in a criminal armory. The network that survived Robert Keogh went to prison. The 60 guns were catalogued, examined, and secured as evidence before their eventual destruction. The NCA and Border Force issued statements congratulating their officers and noting the significance of the seizure. Journalists wrote their stories. The public read them, or didn't. Life went on. What did not end was the organized crime group behind the operation. The NCA's post-sentencing statement acknowledged this directly, describing the seizure as a significant disruption to the OCG's plans rather than as their destruction. The language of disruption is the honest language of law enforcement in this domain. Criminal networks that operate at the level demonstrated by this case are built to absorb losses. They have multiple supply lines, multiple couriers, multiple customers. Losing a shipment, even a wrecking one, is factored into their operational model as a cost of doing business. The people who recruited Keogh, loaded the car in Hackney, managed the Turkish supply chain, and waited in Britain for the delivery were not in the dock at Canterbury Crown Court. They may never be. The structure of OCG operations is specifically designed to ensure that the most culpable and most informed members of the network are insulated from the moment of interdiction. The courier takes the risk. The organizer takes the profit. The courier is caught. The organizer finds another courier. This is one of the most consistently frustrating realities of law enforcement work against organized crime. Every successful seizure at the border is a genuine victory. Weapons taken out of circulation, a courier imprisoned, an OCG financially damaged. But it is a victory in a single battle in a much longer campaign. The demand for illegal firearms in British criminal markets does not diminish because of a port seizure. The supply networks adjust, change their routes, recruit new personnel, and continue. What changes incrementally is the intelligence picture. Every seizure adds data. Every phone examined, every movement reconstructed, every contact identified. These are contributions to a cumulative understanding of how these networks operate. The Keogh case told investigators something about the Turkish supply chain, about the Hackney connection, about the modification techniques being used and the packaging methods being employed. That knowledge, added to the knowledge from other cases before and after, builds towards the kind of comprehensive understanding that can, in time, enable operations that reach further up the supply chain. What the judge said, and what it means. Judge Rupert Lowe's words at the sentencing of Robert Keogh deserved to be read as something more than a courtroom formality. They were a precise statement of potential consequence, a judge looking at the evidence before him and describing in plain language the trajectory those 60 guns would have followed if the border force team at Dover had waved the Volkswagen through. If you had not been stopped, it is highly likely that numerous people would have been threatened, and some shot, and perhaps some killed. Numerous people threatened, some shot, some killed. Not one, not a small number. Numerous, a word that acknowledges the scale of 60 weapons distributed across criminal networks. The judge was not speculating or dramatizing. He was reasoning from the available evidence about what firearms of this kind, entering the criminal market in Britain, characteristically do. Britain's illegal firearms market is not evenly distributed across the country. It is concentrated in specific urban areas, in specific criminal networks, and around specific criminal activities, primarily drug market enforcement and inter-gang territorial disputes. The geography of gun crime in cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester is well mapped by law enforcement and academic researchers alike. When a consignment of 60 handguns enters that geography, it does not sit idle. It is absorbed, distributed, and used. The counterfactual that Judge Lowe described, the Britain in which those 60 guns were not stopped at Dover, is not an abstraction. It is a specific series of events that would have unfolded, with a specific human cost, in specific places. The people who would have been shot are not anonymous statistics. They are people who are alive today, in London and elsewhere, who will never know how close they came to a different outcome. That is what the Border Force officers at Dover Eastern Docks, on a Friday morning in August 2019, actually did. They did not make an arrest. They did not solve a case. They changed specific futures. Futures belonging to specific people whose names they do not know and may never know, by doing their job. The debt, the drive, and the record that should not have been set. Robert Keogh left prison in Ireland in January 2019. He was free. He had served his time. He had presumably every reason to make different choices from the ones he had made before. His addiction was a real and serious problem. But addiction is not destiny. People with gambling problems find help, find support, find pathways out. The resources exist. Instead, less than 8 months after his release, he was driving a Volkswagen Passat through the Channel Tunnel with the largest haul of illegal firearms ever seized at a British port, hidden in its bodywork. The debt was €3,000. The payment was $10,000. The sentence was 9 years. The arithmetic of this equation does not work for anyone except the criminal network that recruited him. They risked Keogh's liberty, not their own. They invested in the weapons, the modification, the vehicle preparation, and the logistics, but they did so behind multiple layers of deniability. When the seizure was made, they lost their shipment and their courier. They did not lose their freedom, their network, or their capacity to repeat the operation with a different person. Keogh is a cautionary story about addiction and vulnerability and the pitiless efficiency with which criminal organizations exploit both. He is also, less sympathetically, a story about choices. The choice to travel to Turkey, the choice to drive the car back through Europe, the choice not to walk into a police station in Hackney and tell someone what was happening to him. The fear he described was real, or may have been, but it did not determine the outcome. It contextualized a set of decisions that he still, at some level, made. And Dover, as always, was waiting. The white cliffs visible from the ferry deck as it approaches the harbor entrance do not look like a border. They look like home, the famous landmark of a country that spent centuries believing its island status made it secure. But security at a modern port is not geography. It is people, training, technology, and the patient professional instinct that looks at a man who says he has been driving around Europe and decides to look more closely. Robert Keogh was the largest single find in British port history. He should not have been. The fact that it took until 2019 for a seizure of 60 firearms to be made at a British port is not a tribute to the effectiveness of Britain's border security. It is a reminder of the volume of what passes through without being found. For every Keogh who is stopped, The intelligence picture suggests that others get through. The record was set, but the traffic that creates the possibility of records continues. At Dover, every morning, the ferries dock and the cars roll off. Officers raid faces, ask questions, make judgments. Most of the time, the cars are exactly what they appear to be. Some of the time, they are not. The officers who stopped Robert Keogh at 5 in the morning on the 2nd of August 2019 knew, from the moment he said he had been driving around, that something was wrong. They trusted that knowledge. They pulled him over, they searched, and they found 60 guns that were never going to be found anywhere good.